The icy winds of a Midwestern winter howled outside the reinforced walls of the underground nuclear missile silo. Nestled in the remote plains of North Dakota, the facility was one of the most secure locations in the United States, a critical component of the country's strategic nuclear deterrent during the height of the Cold War. Deep underground, surrounded by concrete and steel, two men sat in a windowless room bathed in a sterile fluorescent glow. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the equipment and the occasional crackle of static from their radio. Captain James Jim Walker and Lieutenant Michael Mick Henderson had been stationed at the silo for just under a year. Both were seasoned soldiers, selected for this post due to their impeccable records and their ability to remain calm in high-stress situations. They had undergone rigorous training to be ready for the unthinkable, to launch nuclear missiles if ever given the order. It was a routine night shift, like countless others before it. Both men were accustomed to the isolation, the monotony of monitoring systems that rarely changed. They were trained to recognize every beep, every flicker of the console lights. The Cold War tension was something they carried like a weight on their shoulders. But it was also routine, the familiar pulse of an ever-present threat. Still, neither of them ever expected that threat to come from above. "How much longer till your shift's up?" Mick asked, his voice casual as he stretched in his chair. "Couple more hours," Jim replied, eyes on the control panel, his hand casually resting on a cup of lukewarm coffee. "Same as always." Mick chuckled. I sometimes think we're the only two people in the world down here. No one else even remembers we exist until they need us." Jim grinned. "Yeah, well, let's hope they never need us." Their banter was interrupted by a sudden flicker in the lights. Both men froze, eyes darting to the overhead bulbs as they flickered twice more, then steadied. A low hum filled the room, as though the power system was straining. Jim frowned, leaning forward in his chair. "That's weird." Mick checked the control panel, his fingers flying over the keys. "No scheduled maintenance tonight. Systems look normal." Before they could investigate further, a deep, resonating hum echoed through the room, far louder than the usual sounds of the silo's operations. It seemed to reverberate through the walls, rattling the pins on the console. "What the hell is that?" Mick asked, his face tight with confusion. Jim's eyes were already on the radar. The screen showed the usual grid clear, nothing in the sky for miles, but the hum persisted, vibrating in their bones. Then, without warning, the radar screen flickered to life, and a new object appeared, just a blip at first, but rapidly growing. The object was moving fast, much faster than any aircraft Jim had ever seen. "Do you see this?" Mick's voice was tight with disbelief. "Yeah," Jim muttered, his hand gripping the edge of the console. "That's not one of ours." The object hovered on the screen, stationary now about 10 miles north of their location. But what unsettled Jim was not just the speed at which it appeared, but the altitude, far too low for a commercial jet, and unlike anything that matched known flight patterns. "Could be a glitch in the system," Mick suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Before Jim could reply, the console in front of them went dead. All the lights blinked off, the humming stopped, and the room was plunged into an eerie silence, save for the distant wind howling outside. "Backup systems should be kicking in," Jim said, his voice uneasy. But they didn't. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, a single light on the console flickered back to life, a red one. "Jesus, that's the missile arming light," Mick whispered, his voice shaking. He scrambled to his feet, moving to the backup panel to manually override the system. But nothing responded. The keys refused to function, and the blinking red light continued, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Manual override's not working," Mick said, his voice rising in panic. Jim moved to the communications console, trying to reach their superiors at NORAD. He pressed the button, but the line was filled with static. "Alpha 6 to command, come in. Do you copy?" Jim's voice echoed through the silence, but there was no reply, just the hiss of dead air. Then, suddenly, a new sound emerged from the static. A voice, though it was unlike anything they had ever heard before. It was faint at first, unintelligible, just garbled whispers. But it grew louder, sharper, until words began to form. Weapon. Launch now. The words were broken, as if something was struggling to speak through their systems, but the intent was clear. It wasn't a command from their superiors. This was something else, something alien. Mick stared at Jim, his eyes wide with fear. Who the hell is that? Jim shook his head, his fingers gripping the radio. I don't know, but we need to stop this. Now! He tried the manual override again, but the controls were unresponsive. The red lights continued to blink, and suddenly, the entire launch system came to life. The screen flashed with missile trajectories, targeting systems engaging without any input from either of them. Jim could see the familiar grid of global targets, and the nightmare scenario of every soldier in his position unfolded before his eyes. They're arming the missiles, Mick gasped. How the hell are they doing this? The cryptic voice on the radio continued, the words now clearer but still distorted. Weapon. Launch. Prepare. Jim slammed his hand against the console, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He wasn't about to let this happen. Override protocol. Manual disengage. But Mick's hands were shaking as he tried the override one more time. It's not working, Jim. I can't stop it. The tension in the room mounted, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. Sweat dripped down both men's foreheads as the clock counted down toward a potential nuclear launch. Suddenly, the voice on the radio grew louder, and this time it was distinctly threatening. You will comply. We control. Mick's voice cracked with terror. What the hell are we dealing with? Jim didn't respond. He was focused on the screens, which showed all 10 missiles on standby, waiting for the final launch sequence to be initiated. The arming codes were being overridden, as if an invisible hand was typing them in. Outside, the hum returned, louder this time. The entire facility seemed to tremble as if the ground itself was shaking in fear. Jim! Mick shouted, pointing to the radar screen. The object was back, hovering directly above the silo now, almost impossibly close. It wasn't anything either of them could recognize, an enormous disk shining with a strange, pulsing light, hovering in the night sky. They're doing this, Jim whispered, his voice grim. It's them. The craft's presence felt suffocating, as though it was exerting some kind of pressure on their minds, making it difficult to think, to act. The lights in the room began flickering again, casting eerie shadows across the cold, sterile walls. We have to stop this, Mick said, his voice hoarse, frantic. They'll launch the missiles. We have to. Before he could finish, the console flashed again, and a final countdown began. 5 minutes until launch. No! Jim screamed, slamming his fists into the console. We can't let this happen. He grabbed the emergency phone and dialed their supervisor's direct line. The signal took agonizing seconds to connect, but finally, a voice came through. Colonel Harris, their commanding officer. Walker, what's going on down there? Harris barked, his voice filled with suspicion and anger. We're receiving launch warnings. You better have a damn good explanation. Sir, we're not in control, Jim shouted, his voice filled with desperation. The system's been overridden. It's not us, it's something else. Something else. Harris growled. Are you telling me aliens are launching our missiles? Jim hesitated, knowing how ridiculous it sounded, but there was no time for anything else. Yes, sir, there's an object above us. It's controlling the system. We've lost control. Harris was silent for a moment. Then his voice returned, cold and commanding. You need to fix this. Now. We're trying, sir, but nothing's working, Jim replied, his heart pounding in his chest. The clock continued to tick down, 3 minutes left. Jim and Mick shared a panicked glance. The alien craft still hovered above them, its presence ominous and overbearing. Suddenly, the voice from the radio returned, louder and more forceful than ever. Launch. Now! As if in response, the countdown accelerated. 2 minutes. Jim felt a cold sweat break out over his entire body. He knew what would happen if those missiles launched: global devastation, nuclear annihilation. The end of everything. But just as the clock reached 1 minute, something changed. The hum from the craft intensified, filling the room with an almost unbearable pressure. The lights on the console began flickering erratically, and the countdown froze at 30 seconds. Jim and Mick stared at the screen, their breath caught in their throats. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the hum stopped. The lights returned to normal, the red arming lights blinked off, and the console went dark. The countdown vanished from the screen. The UFO was gone. For a moment, neither man spoke. They simply stared at the control panel, their minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Finally, Jim broke the silence. "Is it over?" Mick nodded slowly, still dazed. "I think so." The comm system crackled to life again, and Harris's voice cut through the quiet. "Walker, Henderson, report. What the hell just happened?" Jim picked up the phone, his hand shaking. "Sir, I have no explanation. Everything's back to normal, but what?" Harris demanded. "It was them," Jim said quietly. "The UFO. They stopped it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Harris spoke again, his voice low and measured. "We're sending a team to your location. Sit tight until they arrive." Jim hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, his heart still racing. He and Mick exchanged a look, both knowing that whatever explanation they tried to give, no one would ever believe them. But they knew the truth, and so did their superiors. Whatever had visited them that night, it had come close to ending the world. And for reasons they would never understand, it had decided not to.